Two-Handed Engine by C.L. Moore and Henry Kuttner. Originally published in the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction, 1955. Reprinted by Ballantine Books the same year in a collection of stories from this married writing duo entitled No Boundaries. Read by Darrell T. Smith II for my channel, Quasar Spectra. Ever since the days of Orestes, there have been men with furies following them. It wasn't until the 22nd century that mankind made itself a set of real furies out of steel. Mankind had reached a crisis by then. They had a good reason for building man-shaped furies that would dog the footsteps of all men who kill men. Nobody else. There was by then no other crime of any importance. It worked very simply. Without warning, a man who thought himself safe would suddenly hear the steady footfalls behind him. He would turn and see the two-handed engine walking toward him, shaped like a man of steel and more incorruptible than any man not made of steel could be. Only then would the murderer know he had been tried and condemned by the omniscient electronic minds that knew society as no human mind could ever know it. For the rest of his days, the man would hear those footsteps behind him. A moving jail with invisible bars that shut him off from the world. Never in life would he be alone again, and one day, he never knew when, the jailer would turn executioner. Danner leaned back comfortably in his contoured restaurant chair and rolled expensive wine across his tongue, closing his eyes to enjoy the taste of it better. He felt perfectly safe. Oh, perfectly protected. For nearly an hour now he had been sitting here, ordering the most expensive food, enjoying the music, breathing softly through the air, the murmurous, well-bred hush of his fellow diners. It was a good place to be. It was very good, having so much money, now. True, he had to kill to get the money, but no guilt troubled him. There's no guilt if you aren't found out, and Danner had protection. Protection straight from the source, which was something new in the world. Danner knew the consequences of killing. If Hartz hadn't satisfied him that he was perfectly safe, Danner would never have pulled the trigger. The memory of an archaic word flickered through his mind briefly. Sin. It evoked nothing. Once it had something to do with guilt in an incomprehensible way. Not anymore. Mankind had been through too much. Sin was meaningless now. He dismissed the thought and tried the heart of palms salad. He found he didn't like it. Oh well, you had to expect things like that. Nothing was perfect. He sipped the wine again, liking the way the glass seemed to vibrate like something faintly alive in his hand. It was good wine. He thought of ordering more, but then he thought, no, save it, next time. There was so much before him waiting to be enjoyed. Any risk was worth it. And of course, in this, there had been no risk. Danner was a man born at the wrong time. He was old enough to remember the last days of utopia, young enough to be trapped in the new scarcity economy the machines had clamped down on their makers. In his early youth, he'd had access to free luxuries, like everybody else. He could remember the old days when he was an adolescent and the last of the escape machines were still operating. The glamorous, bright, impossible, vicarious visions that didn't really exist and never could have. But then the scarcity economy swallowed up pleasure. Now you got necessities, but no more. Now you had to work. Danner hated every minute of it. When the swift change came, he'd been too young and unskilled to compete in the scramble. The rich men today were the men who had built fortunes on concerning the few luxuries the machines still produced. All Danner had left were bright memories and a dull, resentful feeling of having been cheated. All he wanted were the bright days back, and he didn't care how he got them. Well, now he had them. He touched the rim of the wine glass with his finger, feeling it sing slightly against the touch. Blown glass? He wondered. He was too ignorant of luxury items to understand, but he'd learn. He had the rest of his life to learn in and be happy. He looked up across the restaurant and saw through the transparent dome of the roof the melting towers of the city. They made a stone forest as far as he could see, and this was only one city. When he was tired of it, there were more. Across the country, across the planet, the network lay that linked city with city in a webwork like a vast, intricate, half-alive monster. Call it society. He felt it tremble a little beneath him. He reached for the wine glass and drank quickly. The faint uneasiness that seemed to shiver the foundations of the city was nothing new. It was because, yes, certainly it was because of a new fear. It was because he had not been found out. That made no sense. Of course the city was complex. Of course it operated on a basis of incorruptible machines. They, and only they, kept man from becoming very quickly another extinct animal. And of these, the analog computers, the electronic calculators, were the gyroscope of all living. They made and enforced the laws that were necessary now to keep mankind alive. Danner didn't understand much of the vast changes that had swept over society in his lifetime, but this much even he knew. So perhaps it made sense that he felt society shiver because he sat here luxurious on foam rubber, sipping wine, hearing soft music, and no fury standing behind his chair to prove that the calculators were still guardians for mankind. If not even the Furies are incorruptible, what can a man believe in? It was at that exact moment that the Fury arrived. Danner heard every sound suddenly die out around him. His fork was halfway to his lips, but he paused, frozen, and looked up across the table and the restaurant toward the door. The Fury was taller than a man. It stood there for a moment, the afternoon sun striking a blinding spot of brightness from its shoulder. It had no face, but it seemed to scan the restaurant leisurely, table by table. Then it stepped in under the doorframe, and the sunspot slid away, and it was like a tall man encased in steel, walking slowly between the tables. Danner said to himself, laying down his untasted food, "Not for me. Everyone else here is wondering. I know." And like a memory in a drowning man's mind, clear, sharp, and condensed into a moment, yet every detail clear, he remembered what Hartz had told him. As a drop of water can pull into its reflection a wide panorama condensed into a tiny focus, so time seemed to focus down to a pinpoint the half-hour Danner and Hartz had spent together, in Hartz's office with the walls that could go transparent at the push of a button. He saw Hartz again, plump and blond, with the sad eyebrows, a man who looked relaxed until he began to talk, and then you felt the burning quality about him, the air of driven tension that made even the air around him seem to be restlessly trembling. Danner stood before Hartz's desk again in memory, feeling the floor hum faintly against his soles with the heartbeat of the computers. You could see them through the glass, smooth, shiny things with winking lights in banks like candles burning in colored glass cups. You could hear their faraway chattering as they ingested facts, meditated them, and then spoke in numbers like cryptic oracles. It took men like Hartz to understand what the oracles meant. "I have a job for you," Hartz said. "I want a man killed." "Oh, no," Danner said. "What kind of a fool do you think I am? Now wait a minute. You can use money, can't you?" "What for?" Danner asked bitterly. "A fancy funeral?" "A life of luxury. I know you're not a fool. I know damned well you wouldn't do what I ask unless you got money and protection. That's what I can offer. Protection." Danner looked through the transparent wall at the computers. "Sure," he said. "No, I mean it. Hartz hesitated, glancing around the room a little uneasily, as if he hardly trusted his own precautions, for making sure of privacy. "This is something new," he said. "I can redirect any fury I want to." "Oh, sure," Danner said again. "It's true. I'll show you. I can pull a fury off any victim I choose." "How?" "Well, that's my secret, naturally. In effect, though, I've found a way to feed in false data so the machines come out with the wrong verdict before conviction or the wrong orders after conviction." "But that's dangerous, isn't it?" "Dangerous?" Hartz looked at Danner under his sad eyebrows. "Well, yes, I think so. That's why I don't do it often. I've done it only once, as a matter of fact. Theoretically, I'd worked out the method. I tested it just once. It worked. I'll do it again, and to prove to you I'm telling the truth. After that, I'll do it once again to protect you, and that will be it. I don't want to upset the calculators any more than I have to. Once your job's done, I won't have to." "Who do you want killed?" Involuntarily, Hartz glanced upward toward the heights of the building where the top-rank executive offices were. "O'Reilly," he said. Danner glanced upward, too, as if he could see through the floor and observe the exalted shoe soles of O'Reilly, controller of the calculators, pacing an expensive carpet overhead. "It's very simple," Hart said. "I want his job." "Why not do your own killing, then, if you're so sure you can stop the Furies?" "Because that would give the whole thing away," Hart said impatiently. "Use your head. I've got an obvious motive. It wouldn't take a calculator to figure out who profits most if O'Reilly dies. If I saved myself from a Fury, people would start wondering how I did it. But you've got no motive for killing O'Reilly. Nobody but the calculators would know, and I'll take care of them." "How do I know you can do it?" "Simple. Watch." Hartz got up and walked quickly across the resilient carpet that gave his steps a falsely youthful bounce. There was a waist-high counter on the far side of the room with a slanting glass screen on it. Nervously, Hartz punched a button, and a map of a section of the city sprang out in bold lines on its surface. "I've got to find a sector where a Fury's in operation now," he explained. The map flickered, and he pressed the button again. The unstable outlines of the city streets wavered and brightened and then went out as he scanned the sections, fast and nervously. Then a map flashed on, which had 3 wavering streaks of colored light crisscrossing it, intersecting at one point near the center. The point moved very slowly across the map at just about the speed of a walking man, reduced to miniature in scale with the street he walked on. Around him, the colored lines wheeled slowly, keeping their focus always steady on the single point. "There," Hart said, leaning forward to read the printed name of the street. A drop of sweat fell from his forehead onto the glass, and he wiped it uneasily away with his fingertip. "There's a man with a Fury assigned to him. All right, now, I'll show you. Look here." Above the desk was a news screen. Hartz clicked it on and watched impatiently while a street scene swam into focus. Crowds, traffic noises, people hurrying, people loitering, and in the middle of the crowd a little oasis of isolation, an island in the sea of humanity. Upon that moving island 2 occupants dwelt, like a Crusoe and a Friday, alone. One of the 2 was a haggard man who watched the ground as he walked. The other islander in this deserted spot was a tall, shining, man-formed shape that followed at his heels. As if invisible walls surrounded them, pressing back the crowds they walked through, the 2 moved in an empty space that closed in behind them, opened up before them. Some of the passers-by stared. Some looked away in embarrassment or uneasiness. Some watched with a frank anticipation, wondering perhaps at just what moment the Friday would lift his steel arm and strike the Crusoe dead. "Watch now," Hart said nervously. "Just a minute. I'm going to pull the Fury off this man. Wait." He crossed to his desk, opened a drawer, bent secretively over it. Danner heard a series of clicks from inside, and then the brief chatter of tapped keys. "Now," Hart said, closing the drawer. He moved the back of his hand across his forehead. "Warm in here, isn't it? Let's get a closer look. You'll see something happen in a minute." Back to the news screen. He flicked the focus switch, and the street scene expanded. The man and his pacing jailer swooped upward into close focus. The man's face seemed to partake subtly of the impassive quality of the robots. You would have thought they had lived a long time together, and perhaps they had. Time is a flexible element, infinitely long sometimes in a very short space. "Wait until they get out of the crowd," Hart said. "This mustn't be conspicuous. There, he's turning now." The man, seeming to move at random, wheeled at an alley corner and went down the narrow, dark passage away from the thoroughfare. The eye of the news screen followed him as closely as the robot. "So you do have cameras that can do that," Danner said with interest. "I always thought so. How's it done? Are they spotted at every corner, or is it a beam trans—" "Never mind," Hart said. "Trade secret. Just watch. We'll have to wait until—" "No, no! Look! He's going to try it now!" The man glanced furtively behind him. The robot was just turning the corner in his wake. Hart darted back to his desk and pulled the drawer open. His hand poised over it. His eyes watched the screen anxiously. It was curious how the man in the alley, though he could have no inkling that other eyes watched, looked up and scanned the sky, gazing directly for a moment into the attentive, hidden camera and the eyes of Hartz and Danner. They saw him take a sudden deep breath and break into a run. From Hartz's drawer sounded a metallic click. The robot, which had moved smoothly into a run the moment the man did, checked itself awkwardly and seemed to totter on its steel feet for an instant. It slowed. It stopped like an engine grinding to a halt. It stood motionless. At the edge of the camera's range, you could see the man's face looking backward, mouth open with shock as he saw the impossible happen. The robot stood there in the alley, making indecisive motions, as if the new orders Hartz pumped into its mechanisms were grating against inbuilt orders in whatever receptor it had. Then it turned its steel back upon the man in the alley and went smoothly, almost sedately, away down the street, walking as precisely as if it were obeying valid orders, not stripping the very gears of society in its aberrant behavior. You got one last glimpse of the man's face, looking strangely stricken, as if his last friend in the world had left him. Hartz switched off the screen. He wiped his forehead again. He went to the glass wall and looked out and down as if he were half afraid the calculators might know what he had done. Looking very small against the background of the metal giants, he said over his shoulder, "Well, Danner?" Was it well? There had been more talk, of course, more persuasion, a raising of the bribe, but Danner knew his mind had been made up from that moment. A calculated risk and worth it, well worth it, except in the deathly silence of the restaurant all motion had stopped. The Fury walked calmly between the tables, threading its shining way, touching no one. Every face blanched, turned toward it. Every mind thought, "Can it be for me?" Even the entirely innocent thought, "This is the first mistake they've ever made, and it's come from me. The first mistake, but there's no appeal, and I could never prove a thing." For while guilt had no meaning in this world, punishment did have meaning, and punishment could be blind, striking like lightning. Danner, between set teeth, told himself over and over, "No, not for me. I'm safe. I'm protected. It hasn't come for me." And yet he thought how strange it was. What a coincidence, wasn't it, that there should be two murderers here under this expensive glass roof today, himself and the one the Fury had come for. He released his fork and heard it clink on the plate. He looked down at it and the food, and suddenly his mind rejected everything around him and went diving off on a fugitive tangent like an ostrich into sand. He thought about food. How did asparagus grow? What did raw food look like? He had never seen any. Food came ready cooked out of restaurant kitchens or automat slots. Potatoes now. What did they look like? A moist white mash? No, for sometimes they were oval slices, so the thing itself must be oval. But not round. Sometimes you got them in long strips squared off at the ends. Something quite long and oval then, chopped into even lengths. And white, of course. And they grew underground, he was almost sure. Long, thin roots twining white arms among the pipes and conduits he had seen laid bare when the streets were under repair. How strange that he should be eating something like thin, ineffectual human arms that embraced the sewers of the city and writhed pallidly where the worms had their being, and where he himself, when the fury found him, might... He pushed the plate away. An indescribable rustling and murmuring in the room lifted his eyes for him as if he were an automaton. The fury was halfway across the room now, and it was almost funny to see the relief of those whom it passed by. 2 or 3 of the women had buried their faces in their hands, and one man had slipped quietly from his chair in a dead faint as the furies passing released their private dreads back into their hidden wells. The thing was quite close now. It looked to be about 7 feet tall, and its motion was very smooth, which was unexpected when you thought about it. Smoother than human motions. Its feet fell with a heavy, measured tread upon the carpet. Thud, thud, thud. Danner tried, impersonally, to calculate what it weighed. You always heard that they made no sound except for that terrible tread, but this one creaked very slightly somewhere. It had no features, but the human mind couldn't help sketching in lightly a sort of airy face upon that blank steel surface, with eyes that seemed to search the room. It was coming closer. Now all eyes were converging toward Danner, and the fury came straight on. It almost looked as if... No, Danner said to himself. Oh no, this can't be. He felt like a man in a nightmare on the verge of waking. Let me wake soon, he thought. Let me wake now, before it gets here. But he did not wake. And now the thing stood over him and the thudding footsteps stopped. There was the faintest possible creaking as it towered over his table, motionless, waiting, its featureless face turned toward his. Danner felt an intolerable tide of heat surge up into his face. Rage, shame, disbelief. His heart pounded so hard the room swam, and a sudden pain like jagged lightning shot through his head from temple to temple. He was on his feet, shouting. No, no, he yelled at the impassive steel. You're wrong. You've made a mistake. Go away, you damned fool. You're wrong. You're wrong. He groped on the table without looking down, found his plate and hurled it straight at the armored chest before him. China shattered. Spilled food smeared a white and green and brown stain over the steel. Danner floundered out of his chair, around the table, past the tall metal figure toward the door. All he could think of now was hearts. Seas of faces swam by him on both sides as he stumbled out of the restaurant. Some watched with avid curiosity, their eyes seeking his. Some did not look at all, but gazed at their plates rigidly or covered their faces with their hands. Behind him, the measured tread came on, and the rhythmic faint creak from somewhere inside the armor. The faces fell away on both sides, and he went through a door without any awareness of opening it. He was in the street. Sweat bathed him, and the air struck icy, though it was not a cold day. He looked blindly left and right, and then plunged for a bank of phone booths half a block away, the image of hearts swimming before his eyes so clearly he blundered into people without seeing them. Dimly he heard indignant voices begin to speak and then die into awestruck silence. The way cleared magically before him. He walked in the newly created island of his isolation up to the nearest booth. After he had closed the glass door, the thunder of his own blood in his ears made the little soundproofed booth reverberate. Through the door he saw the robots stand passionlessly waiting, the the smear of spilled food still streaking its chest like some robotic ribbon of honor across a steel shirt front. Danner tried to dial a number. His fingers were like rubber. He breathed deep and hard, trying to pull himself together. An irrelevant thought floated across the surface of his mind. I forgot to pay for my dinner. And then, a lot of good the money will do me now. Oh, damn Hartz. Damn him. Damn him. He got the number. A girl's face flashed into sharp, clear colors on the screen before him. Good. Expensive screens in the public booths in this part of town, his mind noted impersonally. This is Controller Hartz's office. May I help you? Danner tried twice before he could give his name. He wondered if the girl could see him, and behind him, dimly through the glass, the tall waiting figure. He couldn't tell because she dropped her eyes immediately to what must have been a list on the unseen table before her. I'm sorry Mr. Hartz is out. He won't be back today. The screen drained of light and color. Danner folded back the door and stood up. His knees were unsteady. The robot stood just far enough back to clear the hinge of the door. For a moment they faced each other. Danner heard himself suddenly in the midst of an uncontrollable giggling which even he realized verged on hysteria. The robot, with the smear of food like a ribbon of honor, looked so ridiculous. Danner, to his dim surprise, found that all this while he had been clutching the restaurant napkin in his left hand. Stand back, he said to the robot. Let me out. Oh, you fool, don't you know this is a mistake? His voice quavered. The robot creaked faintly and stepped back. It's bad enough to have you follow me, Danner said. At least you might be clean. A dirty robot is too much. The thought was idiotically unbearable, and he heard tears in his voice. Half laughing, half weeping, he wiped the steel chest clean and threw the napkin to the floor. And it was at that very instant, with the feel of the hard chest still vivid in his memory, that realization finally broke through the protective screen of hysteria, and he remembered the truth. He would never in life be alone again, never while he drew breath, and when he died it would be at these steel hands, perhaps upon this steel chest, with the passionless face bent to his, the last thing in life he would ever see. No human companion, but the black steel skull of the Fury. It took him nearly a week to reach Hartz. During the week, he changed his mind about how long it might take a man followed by a Fury to go mad. The last thing he saw at night was the streetlight shining through the curtains of his expensive hotel suite upon the metal shoulder of his jail. All night long, waking from uneasy slumber, he could hear the faint creaking of some inward mechanism functioning under the armor, and each time he woke, it was to wonder whether he would ever wake again. Would the blow fall while he slept? And what kind of blow? How did the Furies execute? It was always a faint relief to see the bleak light of early morning shine upon the watcher by his bed. At least he had lived through the night, but was this living? And was it worth the burden? He kept his hotel suite. Perhaps the management would have liked him to go, but nothing was said. Possibly they didn't dare. Life took on a strange, transparent quality, like something seen through an invisible wall. Outside of trying to reach Hartz, there was nothing Danner wanted to do. The old desires for luxuries, entertainment, travel had melted away. He wouldn't have traveled alone. He did spend hours in the public library reading all that was available about the Furies. It was here that he first encountered the two haunting and frightening lines Milton wrote when the world was small and simple, mystifying lines that made no certain sense to anybody until man created a Fury out of steel in his own image. But that two-handed engine at the door stands ready to smite once and smite no more. Danner glanced up at his own two-handed engine, motionless at his shoulder, and thought of Milton and the long-ago times when life was simple and easy. He tried to picture the past. The 20th century, when all civilizations together crashed over the brink in one majestic downfall to chaos. And the time before that, when people were different somehow. But how? It was too far and too strange. He could not imagine the time before the machines. But he learned for the first time what had really happened back there in his early years, when the bright world finally blinked out entirely and gray drudgery began, and the Furies were first forged in the likeness of man. Before the really big wars began, technology advanced to the point where machines bred upon machines like living things, and there might have been an Eden on Earth with everybody's wants fully supplied, except that the social sciences fell too far behind the physical sciences. When the decimating wars came on, machines and people fought side by side, steel against steel and man against man, but man was the more perishable. The wars ended when there were no longer two societies left to fight against each other. Societies splintered apart into smaller and smaller groups until a state very close to anarchy set in. The machines licked their metal wounds meanwhile and healed each other as they had been built to do. They had no need for the social sciences. They went on calmly reproducing themselves and handing out to mankind the luxuries which the Age of Eden had designed them to hand out. Imperfectly, of course. Incompletely, because some of their species were wiped out entirely and left no machines to breed and reproduce their kind. But most of them mined their raw materials, refined them, poured and cast the needed parts, made their own fuel, repaired their own injuries, and maintained their breed upon the face of the earth with an efficiency man never even approached. Meanwhile, mankind splintered and splintered away. There were no longer any real groups, not even families. Men didn't need each other much. Emotional attachments dwindled. Men had been conditioned to accept vicarious surrogates, and escapism was fatally easy. Men reoriented their emotions to the escape machines that fed them joyous, impossible adventure and made the waking world seem too dull to bother with. And the birth rate fell and fell. It was a very strange period. Luxury and chaos went hand in hand. Anarchy and inertia were the same thing, and still the birth rate dropped. Eventually, a few people recognized what was happening. Man as a species was on the way out, and man was helpless to do anything about it. But he had a powerful servant. So the time came when some unsung genius saw what would have to be done. Someone saw the situation clearly and set a new pattern in the biggest of the surviving electronic calculators. This was the goal he set. Mankind must be made self-responsible again. You will make this your only goal until you achieve this end. It was simple, but the changes it produced were worldwide, and all human life on the planet altered drastically because of it. The machines were an integrated society, if man was not, and now they had a single set of orders which all of them reorganized to obey. So the days of the free luxuries ended. The escape machines shut up shop. Men were forced back into groups for the sake of survival. They had to undertake now the work the machines withheld, and slowly, common needs and common interests began to spawn the almost lost feeling of human unity again. But it was so slow, and no machine could put back into man what he had lost, the internalized conscience. Individualism had reached its ultimate stage and therefore had been no deterrent to crime for a long while. Without family or clan relations, not even feud retaliation occurred. Conscience failed, since no man identified with any other. The real job of the machines now was to rebuild in man a realistic superego to save him from extinction. A self-responsible society would be a genuinely interdependent one, the leader identifying with the group, and a realistically internalized conscience which would forbid and punish, quote-unquote, sin, the sin of injuring the group with which you identify. And here, the Furies came in. The machines defined murder under any circumstances as the only human crime. This was accurate enough, since it is the only act which can irreplaceably destroy a unit of society. The Furies couldn't prevent crime. Punishment never cures the criminal, but it can prevent others from committing crime through simple fear when they see punishment administered to others. The Furies were the symbol of punishment. They overtly stalked the streets on the heels of their condemned victims, the outward and visible sign that murder is always punished, and punished most publicly and terribly. They were very efficient. They were never wrong. Or at least in theory they were never wrong. And considering the enormous quantities of information stored by now in the analog computers, it seemed likely that the justice of the machines was far more efficient than that of humans could be. Someday, man would rediscover sin. Without it, he had come near to perishing entirely. With it, he might resume his authority over himself and the race of mechanized servants who were helping him to restore his species. But until that day, the Furies would have to stalk the streets, man's conscience in metal guise imposed by the machines man created a long time ago. What Danner did during this time, he scarcely knew. He thought a great deal of the old days when the escape machines still worked, before the machines rationed luxuries. He thought of this sullenly and with resentment, for he could see no point at all in the experiment mankind was embarked on. He had liked it better in the old days, and there were no Furies then either. He drank a good deal. Once he emptied his pockets into the hat of a legless beggar because the man, like himself, was set apart from society by something new and terrible. For Danner, it was the Fury. For the beggar, it was life itself. 30 years ago, he would have lived or died unheeded, tended only by machines. That a beggar could survive at all by begging must be a sign that society was beginning to feel twinges of awakened fellow feeling with its members, but to Danner that meant nothing. He wouldn't be around long enough to know how the story came out. He wanted to talk to the beggar, though the man tried to wheel himself away on his little platform. "Listen," Danner said urgently, following, searching his pockets. "I want to tell you, it doesn't feel the way you think it would. It feels—" He was quite drunk that night, and he followed the beggar until the man threw the money back at him and thrust himself away rapidly on his wheeled platform, while Danner leaned against a building and tried to believe in its solidity. But only the shadow of the Fury falling across him from the street lamp was real. Later that night, somewhere in the dark, he attacked the Fury. He seemed to remember finding a length of pipe somewhere, and he struck showers of sparks from the great, impervious shoulders above him. Then he ran, doubling and twisting up alleys, and in the end, he hid in a dark doorway, waiting until the steady footsteps resounded through the night. He fell asleep, exhausted. It was the next day that he finally reached Hart's. "What went wrong?" Danner asked. In the past week he had changed a good deal. His face was taking on, in its impassivity, an odd resemblance to the metal mask of the robot. Hart's struck the desk edge a nervous blow, grimacing when he hurt his hand. The room seemed to be vibrating, not with the pulse of the machines below, but with his own tense energy. "Something went wrong," he said. "I don't know yet. You don't know?" Danner lost part of his impassivity. "Now wait!" Hartz made soothing motions with his hands. "Just hang on a little longer. It'll be all right. You can—" "How much longer have I got?" Danner asked. He looked over his shoulder at the tall Fury standing behind him as if he were really asking the question of it, not Hartz. There was a feeling somehow about the way he said it that made you think he must have asked that question many times, looking up into the blank steel face, and would go on asking hopelessly until the answer came at last, but not in words. "I can't even find that out," Hartz said. "Damn it, Danner, this was a risk. You knew that. You said you could control the computer. I saw you do it. I want to know why you didn't do what you promised. Something went wrong, I tell you. It should have worked. The minute this business came up, I fed in the data that should have protected you. But what happened?" Hartz got up and began to pace the resilient flooring. "I just don't know. We don't understand the potentiality of the machines, that's all. I thought I could do it, but..." "You thought?" "I know I can do it. I'm still trying. I'm trying everything. After all, this is important to me, too. I'm working as fast as I can. That's why I couldn't see you before. I'm certain I can do it, if I can work this out my own way. Damn it, Danner, this is complex. And it's not like juggling a comptometer. Look at those things out there." Danner did not bother to look. "You'd better do it," he said. "That's all." Hartz said furiously, "Don't threaten me. Let me alone and I'll work it out, but don't threaten me." "You're in this too," Danner said. Hartz went back to his desk and sat down on the edge of it. "How?" he asked. "O'Reilly's dead. You paid me to kill him." Hartz shrugged. "The Fury knows that," he said. "The computers know it, and it doesn't matter a damn bit. Your hand pulled the trigger, not mine. We're both guilty. If I suffer for it, you..." "Now, wait a minute. Get this straight. I thought you knew it. It's a basis of law enforcement, and always has been. Nobody's punished for intention, only for actions. I'm no more responsible for O'Reilly's death than the gun you used on him. But you lied to me. You tricked me. You'll do as I say if you want to save yourself. I didn't trick you. I just made a mistake. Give me time and I'll retrieve it." "How long?" This time both men looked at the Fury. It stood impassive. "I don't know how long." Danner answered his own question. "You say you don't. Nobody even knows how he'll kill me when the time comes. I've been reading everything that's available to the public about this. Is it true that the method varies just to keep people like me on tenterhooks? And the time allowed, doesn't that vary too?" "Yes, it's true, but there's a minimum time, I'm almost sure. You must still be within it. Believe me, Danner, I can still call off the Fury. You saw me do it. You know it worked once. All I've got to find out is what went wrong this time. But the more you bother me, the more I'll be delayed. I'll get in touch with you. Don't try to see me again." Danner was on his feet. He took a few quick steps toward Hartz, fury and frustration breaking up the impassive mask which despair had been forming over his face. But the solemn footsteps of the Fury sounded behind him. He stopped. The two men looked at each other. "Give me time," Hartz said. "Trust me, Danner." In a way, it was worse, having hope. There must, until now, have been a kind of numbness of despair that had kept him from feeling too much, but now there was a chance that after all he might escape into the bright and new life he had risked so much for, if Hartz could save him in time. Now, for a period, he began to savor experience again. He bought new clothes. He traveled, though never, of course, alone. He even sought human companionship again and found it, after a fashion. But the kind of people willing to associate with a man under this sort of death sentence was not a very appealing type. He found, for instance, that some women felt strongly attracted to him not because of himself or his money, but for the sake of his companion. They seemed enthralled by the opportunity for a close, safe brush with the very instrument of destiny. Over his very shoulder, sometimes, he would realize they watched the fury in an ecstasy of fascinated anticipation. In a strange reaction of jealousy, he dropped such people as soon as he recognized the first coldly flirtatious glance one of them cast at the robot behind him. He tried farther travel. He took the rocket to Africa and came back by way of the rainforests of South America, but neither the nightclubs nor the exotic newness of strange places seemed to touch him in any way that mattered. The sunlight looked much the same, reflecting from the curved steel surfaces of his follower, whether it shone over lion-colored savannas or filtered through the hanging gardens of the jungles. All novelty grew dull quickly because of the dreadfully familiar thing that stood forever at his shoulder. He could enjoy nothing at all. And the rhythmic beat of footfalls behind him began to grow unendurable. He used earplugs, but the heavy vibration throbbed through his skull in a constant measure like an eternal headache. Even when the fury stood still, he could hear in his head the imaginary beating of its steps. He bought weapons and tried to destroy the robot. Of course he failed, and even if he succeeded, he knew another would be assigned to him. Liquor and drugs were no good. Suicide came more and more often into his mind, but he postponed that thought because Hartz had said there was still hope. In the end, he came back to the city to be near Hartz and hope. Again, he found himself spending most of his time in the library, walking no more than he had to because of the footsteps that thudded behind him. And it was here, one morning, that he found the answer. He had gone through all available factual material about the Furies. He had gone through all the literary references collated under that heading, astonished to find how many there were and how apt some of them had become, like Milton's two-handed engine, after the lapse of all these centuries. Those strong feet that followed after, he read, with unhurrying chase and unperturbed pace, deliberate speed, majestic instancy. He turned the page and saw himself and his plight more literally than any allegory. I shook the pillaring hours and pulled my life upon me, grimed with smears. I stand amid the dust of the mounded years. My mangled youth lies dead beneath the heap. He let several tears of self-pity fall upon the page that pictured him so clearly. But then he passed on from literary references to the library's store of filmed plays, because some of them were cross-indexed under the heading he sought. He watched Orestes hounded in modern dress from Argos to Athens, with a single 7-foot robot fury at his heels instead of the 3 snake-haired Erinyes of legend. There had been an outburst of plays on the theme when the Furies first came into usage. Sunk in a half-dream of his own boyhood, memories when the escape machines still operated, Danner lost himself in the action of the films. He lost himself so completely that when the familiar scene first flashed by him in the viewing booth, he hardly questioned it. The whole experience was part of a familiar boyhood pattern, and he was not at first surprised to find one scene more vividly familiar than the rest. But then memory rang a bell in his mind, and he sat up sharply and brought his fist down with a bang on the stop action button. He spun the film back and ran the scene over again. It showed a man walking with his fury through city traffic, the two of them moving in a little desert island of their own making, like a Crusoe with a Friday at his heels. It showed the man turn into an alley, glance up at the camera anxiously, take a deep breath, and break into a sudden run. It showed the fury hesitate, make indecisive motions, and then turn and walk quietly and calmly away in the other direction, its feet ringing on the pavement hollowly. Danner spun the film back again and ran the scene once more just to make doubly sure. He was shaking so hard he could scarcely manipulate the viewer. "How do you like that?" he muttered to the fury behind him in the dim booth. He had by now formed a habit of talking to the fury a good deal, in a rapid, mumbling undertone, not really aware he did it. "What do you make of that, you? Seen it before, haven't you? Familiar, isn't it? Isn't it? Isn't it? Answer me, you damn dumb hulk!" And reaching backward, he struck the robot across the chest as he would have struck Hartz if he could. The blow made a hollow sound in the booth, but the robot made no other response, though when Danner looked back inquiringly at it, he saw the reflections of the overfamiliar scene, running a third time on the screen, running in tiny reflection across the robot's chest and faceless head, as if it too remembered. So now he knew the answer, and Hartz had never possessed the power he claimed, or if he did, had no intention of using it to help Danner. Why should he? His risk was over now. No wonder Hartz had been so nervous running that film strip off on a news screen in his office. But the anxiety sprang not from the dangerous thing he was tampering with, but from sheer strain in matching his activities to the action in the play. How he must have rehearsed it, timing every move, and how he must have laughed afterward. "How long have I got?" Danner demanded fiercely, striking a hollow reverberation from the robot's chest. "How long? Answer me. Long enough?" Release from hope was an ecstasy now. He need not wait any longer. He need not try any more. All he had to do was get to Hartz and get there fast before his own time ran out. He thought with revulsion of all the days he had wasted already in travel and time-killing, when for all he knew his own last minutes might be draining away now, before Hartz's did. "Come along," he said needlessly to the fury. "Hurry." It came, matching its speed to his, the enigmatic timer inside it ticking the moments away toward that instant when the two-handed engine would smite once and smite no more. Hartz sat in the controller's office behind a brand-new desk, looking down from the very top of the pyramid now over the banks of computers that kept society running and cracked the whip over mankind. He sighed with deep content. The only thing was, he found himself thinking a good deal about Danner, dreaming of him even. Not with guilt, because guilt implies conscience, and the long schooling in anarchic individualism was still deep in the roots of every man's mind, but with uneasiness, perhaps. Thinking of Danner, he leaned back and unlocked a small drawer which he had transferred from his old desk to the new. He slid his hand in and let his fingers touch the controls lightly, idly, quite idly. 2 movements, and he could save Danner's life. For of course he had lied to Danner straight through. He could control the Furies very easily. He could save Danner, but he had never intended to. There was no need. And the thing was dangerous. You tamper once with a mechanism as complex as that which controlled society, and there would be no telling where the maladjustment might end. Chain reaction, maybe, throwing the whole organization out of kilter. No. He might someday have to use the device in the drawer. He hoped not. He pushed the drawer shut quickly and heard the soft click of the lock. He was controller now, guardian, in a sense, of the machines which were faithful in a way no man could ever be. Qui custodiet, Hartz thought. The old problem, and the answer was nobody. Nobody today. He himself had no superiors, and his power was absolute. Because of this little mechanism in the drawer, nobody controlled the controller. Not an internal conscience, and not an external one. Nothing could touch him. Hearing the footsteps on the stairs, he thought for a moment he must be dreaming. He had sometimes dreamed that he was Danner, with those relentless footfalls thudding after him. But he was awake now. It was strange that he caught the almost subsonic beat of the approaching metal feet before he heard the storming steps of Danner rushing up his private stairs. The whole thing happened so fast that time seemed to have no connection with it. First he heard the heavy subsonic beat, then the sudden tumult of shouts and banging doors downstairs, and then last of all the thump of Danner charging up the stairs, his steps so perfectly matched by the heavier thud of the robots that the metal trampling drowned out the tramp of flesh and bone and leather. Then Danner flung the door open with a crash, and the shouts and the tramplings from below funneled upward into the quiet office like a cyclone rushing toward the hearer. But a cyclone and a nightmare, because it would never get any nearer. Time had stopped. Time had stopped with Danner in the doorway, his face convulsed, both hands holding the revolver because he shook so badly he could not brace it with one. Hartz acted without any more thought than a robot. He had dreamed of this moment too often in one form or another. If he could have tampered with the Fury to the extent of hurrying Danner's death, he would have done it. But he didn't know how. He could only wait it out as anxiously as Danner himself, hoping against hope that the blow would fall and the executioner strike before Danner guessed the truth, or gave up hope. So Hartz was ready when trouble came. He found his own gun in his hand without the least recollection of having opened the drawer. The trouble was that time had stopped. He knew in the back of his mind that the Fury must stop Danner from injuring anybody. But Danner stood in the doorway alone, the revolver in both shaking hands. And farther back, behind the knowledge of the Fury's duty, Hartz's mind held the knowledge that the machines could be stopped. The Furies could fail. He dared not trust his life to their incorruptibility because he himself was the source of a corruption that could stop them in their tracks. The gun was in his hand without his knowledge. The trigger pressed his finger and the revolver kicked back against his palm, and the spurt of the explosion made the air hiss between him and Danner. He heard his bullet clang on metal. Time started again, running double pace to catch up. The Fury had been no more than a single pace behind Danner after all, because its steel arm encircled him and its steel hand was deflecting Danner's gun. Danner had fired, yes, but not soon enough, not before the Fury reached him. Hartz's bullet struck first. It struck Danner in the chest, exploding through him, and rang upon the steel chest of the Fury behind him. Danner's face smoothed out into a blankness as complete as the blankness of the mask above his head. He slumped backward, not falling because of the robot's embrace, but slowly slipping to the floor between the Fury's arm and its impervious metal body. His revolver thumped softly to the carpet. Blood welled from his chest and back. The robot stood there impassive, a streak of Danner's blood slanting across its metal chest like a robotic ribbon of honor. The Fury and the controller of the Furies stood staring at each other. And the Fury could not, of course, speak, but in Hartz's mind it seemed to. Self-defense is no excuse, the Fury seemed to be saying. We never punish intent, but we always punish action. Any act of murder. Any act of murder. Hartz barely had time to drop his revolver in his desk drawer before the first of the clamorous crowd from downstairs came bursting through the door. He barely had the presence of mind to do it either. He had not really thought the thing through this far. It was, on the surface, a clear case of suicide. In a slightly unsteady voice, he heard himself explaining. Everybody had seen the madman rushing through the office, his Fury at his heels. This wouldn't be the first time a killer and his Fury had tried to get at the controller, begging him to call off the jailer and forestall the executioner. What had happened, Hartz told his underlings calmly enough, was that the Fury had naturally stopped the man from shooting Hartz. and the victim had then turned his gun upon himself. Powder burns on his clothing showed it. The desk was very near the door. Back blast in the skin of Danner's hands would show he had really fired a gun. Suicide. It would satisfy any human, but it would not satisfy the computers. They carried the dead man out. They left Hartz and the Fury alone, still facing each other across the desk. If anyone thought this was strange, nobody showed it. Hartz himself didn't know if it was strange or not. Nothing like this had ever happened before. Nobody had ever been fool enough to commit murder in the very presence of a Fury. Even the controller did not know exactly how the computers assessed evidence and fixed guilt. Should this Fury have been recalled normally? If Danner's death were really suicide, would Hartz stand here alone now? He knew the machines were already processing the evidence of what had really happened here. What he couldn't be sure of was whether this Fury had already received its orders and would follow him wherever he went from now on until the hour of his death, or whether it simply stood motionless, waiting recall. Well, it didn't matter. This Fury or another was already in the present moment in the process of receiving instructions about him. There was only one thing to do. Thank God there was something he could do. So Hartz unlocked the desk drawer and slid it open, touched the clicking keys he had never expected to use. Very carefully he fed the coded information, digit by digit, into the computers. As he did, he looked out through the glass wall and imagined he could see down there in the hidden tapes the units of data fading into blankness and the new, false information flashing into existence. He looked up at the robot. He smiled a little. "Now you'll forget," he said. "You and the computers. You can go now. I won't be seeing you again." Either the computers worked incredibly fast, as of course they did, or pure coincidence took over because in only a moment or two the Fury moved as if in response to Hartz's dismissal. It had stood quite motionless since Danner slid through its arms. Now new orders animated it, and briefly its motion was almost jerky as it changed from one set of instructions to another. It almost seemed to bow, a stiff little bending motion that brought its head down to a level with Hartz's. He saw his own face reflected in the blank face of the Fury. You could very nearly read an ironic note in that stiff bow with the diplomat's ribbon of honor across the chest of the creature, symbol of duty discharged honorably. But there was nothing honorable about this withdrawal. The incorruptible metal was putting on corruption and looking back at Hartz with the reflection of his own face. He watched it stalk toward the door. He heard it go thudding evenly down the stairs. He could feel the thuds vibrate in the floor, and there was a sudden sick dizziness in him when he thought the whole fabric of society was shaking under his feet. The machines were corruptible. Mankind's survival still depended on the computers, and the computers could not be trusted. Hartz looked down and saw that his hands were shaking. He shut the drawer and heard the lock click softly. He gazed at his hands. He felt their shaking echoed in an inner shaking, a terrifying sense of the instability of the world. A sudden, appalling loneliness swept over him like a cold wind. He had never felt before so urgent a need for the companionship of his own kind. No one person, but people, just people. The sense of human beings all around him, a very primitive need. He got his hat and coat and went downstairs rapidly, hands deep in his pockets, because of some inner chill no coat could guard against. Halfway down the stairs, he stopped dead still. There were footsteps behind him. He dared not look back at first. He knew those footsteps, but he had two fears he didn't know which was worse, the fear that a Fury was after him, and the fear that it was not. There would be a sort of insane relief, if it really was, because then he could trust the machines after all, and this terrible loneliness might pass over him and go. He took another downward step, not looking back. He heard the ominous footfall behind him, echoing his own. He sighed one deep sigh and looked back. There was nothing on the stairs. He went on down after a timeless pause, watching over his shoulder. He could hear the relentless feet thudding behind him, but no visible fury followed. No visible fury. The araignées had struck inward again, and an invisible fury of the mind followed Hartz down the stairs. It was as if sin had come anew into the world, and the first man felt again the first inward guilt. So the computers had not failed after all. Hartz went slowly down the steps and out into the street, still hearing, as he would always hear, the relentless, incorruptible footsteps behind him that no longer rang like metal.